Okay, so our next speaker this morning is a faculty of the Department of History and International Studies of Xavier Ateneo. And he is a pure Iliganon. And I should say, he has so much love for Iligan City. Reason why he just can't control himself but keep on digging the stories of the past of his own homeland. And he's also a father of two and one wife. One wife. Okay, so his topic today is very interesting. I believe uh, we will be sharing the same interest as well, because in the mainstream history books, what we could only just read is the Bataan Death March. But today, our speaker will be sharing to us another death march in the Philippines, which happened in his hometown. So the title of his paper, or I mean his presentation today, is The Iligan Death March, What We Should Know About It. Please help me welcome our second speaker, Professor Roderico Dumaug Jr.
Thank you so much, Sir Christian, for that introduction. And I am here in Iligan City, and I am not a historian by profession. I am a political science practitioner, and because, as I've said, of my utter love in my to my hometown, Iligan City, I'm always interested with its history. I'm going to share to you my screen. Okay. Maayong buntag sa tanan. Good morning, everyone. And in line with the observance of the World War II liberation as observed by the American Spaces Philippines, and this event to remember the heroism of the Americans and Filipinos in Northern Mindanao during the Second World War is initiated by the American Corner Cagayan de Oro. And today, my presentation is about the Second World War, Iligan, and the title of my presentation is The Iligan Death March, What We Should Know About It. And first and foremost, as a faculty member in a university teaching politics, political science, international politics, global diplomacy, and public international law, part of our class lectures are the war atrocities and the organization of the International Military Tribunal that tried cases against war criminals, especially right after the Second World War. And for several years that I've been teaching these subjects, death marches that happened around the world, particularly in Southeast Asia, is one of our major discussion. As an Iliganon, I am from Iligan City, I'm always come across one of the two death marches in the Philippines, and that is the Iligan Death March. I cannot find major articles and other literatures that discuss in details about this historical event in Iligan, except for one recently in his online research written by Mr. Robert John A. Dunesa, published in the International Journal of Innovation, Creativity, and Change, about the one which he called the Mindanao Death March. The scope of my presentation is actually, I really want to articulate to the public the various sources that will help us understand and perhaps will be able to reconstruct the history of the Iligan Death March. And the sources will give us details about this event during the Second World War in Iligan City. And aside from sharing to the public the details of the Iligan Death March, it is also my intention that through this presentation, I will be able to promote international criminal law, which will help us, which will be an instrument in maintaining international peace and security. Second, it is also my belief that by continually discussing local history, we will be able to generate heroism and inspire the young people to act for the common good. And thirdly, it is my intention that I'll be able to promote international dialogue and friendship, especially for the people of the United States of America, Japan, and the Philippines, particularly here in Iligan City. There are actually 10 primary sources that I will be sharing to you this morning that will give us knowledge about the Death March in Iligan. And these sources are the following. The first one is the exhibit of evidence that was presented to the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. The second one is one of the papers called, it is named as the Chase Papers, in one of the digital library now available in the New Mexico State University in the United States of America. The third one is a book published by one of the survivors of the Iligan Death March. The title of that book is The Butcher, the Baker. The fourth source is also a book published by another survivor of the Iligan Death March entitled Mitsui Madhouse. The fifth one is another book written by one of the survivors of the Iligan Death March, Mr. Peterson. The title of the book is The War Years. I will also be presenting to you an interview of one of the uh, veterans of the survivors of the Iligan Death March, Richard Beck. And the seventh source is also a testimony, oral and written testimony of Frederick Fullerton. Sources 8 and 9 and 10 are very interesting because I will be presenting to you some cases that were brought before the U.S. Military Commission, organized by General Douglas MacArthur to try those war criminals, Japanese war criminals, for the atrocities they committed in the Philippines, especially in Iligan City. And one of those mentioned was the Iligan Death March. And before I am going to proceed, I have first to define what do you mean by Death March. And I'm using the definition from the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in their judgment rendered on November 4, 1948. And Death March is referred to as in which prisoners, including the sick, were forced to march in long distances under conditions which not even well-conditioned troops could stand, and many of those dropping out were being shot or bayoneted by the guards. I would say that General Douglas MacArthur was primarily responsible in the organization of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. And compared to the Nuremberg Military Tribunal that tried the Nazi military officials in Germany right after the Second World War, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East had no existing international agreement among the Allies for its organization. General MacArthur used his enormous power as being selected, as appointed as the supreme commander of the Allied powers, SCAP, when the Americans occupied Japan right after the war. Although there was no international agreement, but the IMTF, its organization, was anchored on the 1945 Potsdam Agreement, where the Allies agreed to try Japanese officials and high-ranking officials for war crimes. And the following are the several counts of war crimes that were charged against the Japanese military and civilian high-ranking officials. And these are: number one, conspiracy to wage aggressive wars; number two, actual waging of aggressive war; three, conspiracy to violate the laws and customs of war; and four, reckless disregard to prevent breaches of laws and customs of war. Death marches that happen in Southeast Asia are one of those atrocities that the Japanese high-ranking military officials were accused of. In the Philippines, there were two death marches that were presented, and these are the Bataan Death March, and the second one, which is the topic my presentation, is the Iligan Death March. And there were several Japanese military and civilian high-ranking officials that were charged, indicted, and convicted before the military tribunal. And I would say that the highest ranking official that was being charged and convicted by the military tribunal was the former head of government of Japan during the Second World War, the former Prime Minister of Japan, Hideki Tojo, and he was convicted. He was indicted and convicted. And one of those atrocities that was charged against him was the Iligan Death March. Likewise, General MacArthur, through his enormous power as the supreme commander of the Allied powers occupying Japan, he appointed the members or the judges who heads the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. One of those judges was a Filipino, a survivor of the Bataan Death March, Delphine Haranilla. And just last year, Netflix released a movie, an original movie entitled Tokyo Trial, which give us the story, some of the controversies in the organization and in the decisions made by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. And I think it is still available in Netflix at present. Former President Seri Usmeña of the Philippines also appointed uh, uh, a military official, Filipino military official, a veteran of the Second World War, Pedro Lopez, as one of the prosecutors of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. And the prosecuting teams prosecuting the accused in this particular case presented 4,336 exhibits, 779 depositions, and presented 419 witnesses. And the first source that I am going to discuss to you that will tell us about the Iligan Death March, I got this one from the Digital Library of the University of Virginia, is the index of exhibits that were presented before the International Military Tribunal. And you can see in this document, you can see here that there's the document number referring to document number 2826, and it is also being referred to as prosecution number 1454. And when it was accepted in evidence, it has given a particular number, and this one is the summary of evidence coming from the Judge Advocate General of the United States of America, JAG Report number 285 on the death march from Camp Keithley to Iligan, Lanao, Mindanao on the 4th of July in 1942. This was presented in the military tribunal. And related to the index of exhibits is another document showing the Japanese translation of the summary of evidence on the death march. It proved that the defendants to this case, including former Prime Minister Tojo, have read the case about this, the summary of the Iligan Death March. You can see there the document number 2826, and also in the Japanese translation, the document number 2826 referring to the Iligan Death March. And in addition to those documents, I also have here these documents which I also got from the University of Virginia showing the ordering of the presentation of witnesses and evidences to the military tribunal. The Iligan Death March was presented in the 107th order presentation, next after witness Fliniao, and mentioning the atrocities committed by the Japanese war criminals. And indeed, those documents were actually presented as evidence, as shown from these minutes of the proceedings. Document numbers 2826, I have underlined it, were submitted were used and submitted to the International Military Tribunal. And in fact, during the presentation of the voluminous documents by the prosecution, the president of the military tribunal asked the prosecution in terms of how many pages he was submitting, and it's around 14,471 pages. And one of those is the Iligan Death March, and it can give us an idea about the details of the Iligan Death March. I hope we will have access to these documents and read in details what really happened on July 4, 1942, which we now call as the Iligan Death March. And in the transcript of proceedings dated December 10 of 1946, it shows the minutes on the presentation of evidence about the Iligan Death March. If I'm going to read this one to you, it's very clear. It says that the Bataan March had a counterpart in Mindanao. On 4th of July 1942, about 600 American and Filipino prisoners of war were grimly reminded of American Independence Day when compelled to march under a blistering sun from Camp Keithley to Iligan, a distance of about 38 kilometers. Many were without shoes and hats. I noticed this one also in some of the testimonies of the survivors. On the way, many were badly mistreated and several were shot and killed. And it was also presented on December 12. The evidence was also presented by the Filipino prosecutor Pedro Lopez on December 12, 1942. The evidence showing the July 4 Iligan Death March. In the closing argument before the International Military Tribunal, this is quite important. This document is very important because in the closing argument before the Military Tribunal, item F already mentioned, aside from the Bataan Death March, is the Iligan Death March. That is why I am using the word Iligan Death March instead of Mindanao Death March, because based on the records from the International Military Tribunal, they referred it as the Iligan Death March. And here, if I'm going to read to you in the closing arguments, in item F 106-A, a milder counterpart of the Bataan Death March happened on July 4, 1942 in Lanao. On that day, American and Filipino forces were forced to march from Keithley to Iligan, Lanao, a distance of about 36 kilometers, with Balay-Balay as their destination. During the march, a prisoner was sick and unable to keep pace with the rest and was shot. No food or water was given to the prisoners. And the International Military Tribunal rendered their decision and convicted former Prime Minister of Japan, Hideki Tojo, and on November 11 of 1948, and he was sentenced to death by hanging by the International War Crime Tribunal. And one of those atrocities that he was guilty of was the one that happened in Iligan on July 4 of 1942, which I called as the Iligan Death March. The second source that I'm going to give to you is another a very interesting one, which is we can find it in the digital library of New Mexico State University, and I learned it that New Mexico of the United States of America, several thousands of their young men were stationed in the Philippines during the Second World War, and thousands of their young men died in the Bataan Death March, in Corregidor, and in various concentration camps in the Philippines, including those that were concentrated, those who were sent to the concentration camp in Camp Keithley, then marched through Iligan in that famous Iligan Death March. And one of their young men from New Mexico, from the state of New Mexico in the United States of America, is the grandson of a senator of the United States of America, First Lieutenant Albert Fall Chase. He survived in the Death March, in the Iligan Death March, but he died in one of the Japanese hell ships when he was brought to one of the concentration camps in Japan. His life was published in Southern New Mexico Historical Review, and it is available. You can read it. And three things that I noticed from his biography, from his life story of First Lieutenant Albert Fall Chase. The first one, he discussed through his several letters about his stay in Iligan City before the war, and his close friendship to the local parish priest, which is very interesting, a Jesuit priest, Father Andrew Cervini. To others, they pronounce it as Cervini, others would say Cervini. And he was the local parish priest of Iligan City during the war. The second important thing is that through his letters to his family, he said that they were stationed in Iligan City so that they would be able to defend the city, including the roads going to Lanao or to Dansalan. And he was not able to survive the hell ships, the Japanese hell ships, and through the letters of Father Andrew Cerveni and some of the survivors of the Death March, narrated the life of Lieutenant Albert Chase during the 4th of July Death March from Dansalan to Iligan. And it is, of course, very interesting that I have to mention Father Andrew F. Cervini, a Jesuit parish priest in Iligan City during the Second World War, because all of the testimonies of the survivors of the Second World War made mention of the support and the heroism of Father Andrew Cervini. And I think only very few of us know about it. And there is a building in Xavier University named after Father Andrew F. Cervini. And in one of the newspapers in the United States of America, I've learned that in New York City, they have this Father Cervini Day, celebrating the heroism of Father Cervini because he was instrumental in securing the exit of former President Quezon and his family and General Douglas MacArthur out out from the Philippines and going to Australia. And I would say we have to make some what you call this one some research in terms of the contribution of Father Andrew F. Cervini, a Jesuit priest in Iligan City. The third and the fourth primary source that I'm going to present to you are books that were published by the survivors of the Iligan Death March. One was made by Victor L. Mapes. He survived in the Iligan Death March, and he was sent to the various concentration camps in the Philippines, and finally he was rescued in one of the concentration camps in Japan. And he made mention about the excuse me, and he made mention about the Iligan Death March. The second one is a book also published, written by another survivor of the Iligan Death March, Herbert Zinke. The title of his book is Mitsui Madhouse. And what is so interesting with this book is that he gave a detailed information of the event prior to the Death March, especially the landing of the Japanese in Parang, and then their engagement of the Japanese against the Japanese in Malabang, and then their surrender, before their surrender to the Japanese in Dansalan. And he made mention that their commanding officer, Brigadier General Guy O. Fourth, ordered them that before they're going to surrender, they have to shave their head, and they must appear in uniform when they are going to surrender. Okay. The fifth source that I'm going to present to you is a very interesting one. I would like to discuss on this one. It's about one of the survivors of the Death March, Richard Peterson, and he wrote a book about his life during the Second World War. He survived the Iligan Death March and in several concentration camps in the Philippines, and was rescued in one of the concentration camps in Japan. And he made mention here about the Iligan Death March. And one thing that you notice in several testimonies of the survivors is that those who were participating, were forced to march, were lined up in columns of 4 and wired together around the waist. This made Iligan Death March quite different from the from the Bataan Death March, because in the Bataan Death March, the marchers were not tied, but in the Iligan Death March, the Americans were tied together with a telephone wire. Another one which is interesting is the photo of Richard Peterson, because this photo, in the caption, you can see it from I got this one from the Library of Congress in the United States of America, that this photo is coming from the prisoner of war processing photo dated 1942, and most probably this was taken right after the Iligan Death March. And look at his head, because in the book of Zinke and the Mitsui Madhouse, he made mention that Brigadier General Guy O. Fort ordered them to shave their heads, and this sad and grim face of Richard Peterson. And I highly believe that there are probably several photos about the Death March, because in one of the books made mention that the Japanese announced it in Iligan City that they're going to have an Independence Day parade from Dansalan to Iligan City. And I would say that, and probably in some government offices in the United States of America or in the Philippines, in the private collections, probably they have photos of the Iligan Death March, and I hope they can share this one to us, because in the Bataan Death March there are photos on this. The third one is we have here a testimony of one of the survivors, Richard Beck, and please listen to this video.
You were on the Bataan Death March.
No, I was on a death march in Mindanao.
Mindanao. Okay. Now, what were you doing there?
At Iligan, they had us in a schoolhouse, and a Japanese officer came and said that he needed a collection to hire a boat to take us to Cagayan, which was about 100 miles away.
The two things that you will learn from this video, which was interviewed a few years ago, about mentioned about the death march, and I'm so interested also about the schoolhouse where the prisoners were kept by the Japanese right after the death march, and I suspect that this is the present-day St. Michael's College in Iligan City, where I finished my secondary education. The second is the testimony of Frederick in Fullerton. He was also interviewed a few years ago. He was a veteran, a World War II veteran, and a survivor of the Iligan Death March. Please listen and to this video of Fullerton.
The next day, the 4th of July, the Japanese marched us from Dansalan to Iligan, a distance of about 25, 26 miles. The Americans, there was only 44 Americans left at that time. Americans were all tied together in groups of 4, and we went on a forced march then. The Filipinos that were left in our divisions only numbered about 500 men, including enlisted men and officers. On the road going to, marching from Dansalan to Iligan, 2 Americans were killed because they couldn't keep up. Some 18 or 20 Filipinos were killed because they weren't able to keep up. And after we arrived in Iligan that night, another American officer died from exhaustion.
So this is the video of one of the survivors of the Iligan Death March, and in fact, Frederick M. Fullerton have written around 200, I think 250 pages of his testimony during the Second World War. I have a copy of his testimony. And what was so interesting, 2 things very interesting on his, 3 things that are very interesting on his testimony. The first one is he described in details his life in Iligan City, because he stayed for a long time in Iligan City before the war. The people he met, the buildings, the businesses, the hotels, the foreigners that were in Iligan City. Then, of course, he also made mention in details about the Iligan Death March. And the third one, he also made mention of the schoolhouse, the Catholic schoolhouse, where the prisoners of war were kept after the death march. So I have here, he made mention about in Iligan City, he mentioned about Father Andrew Cervini, the parish priest in Iligan City at the time, and then some of the American soldiers that were stationed in Iligan City at the time, including Fullerton, stayed in the convent of Father Andrew Cervini. And another one that is very interesting is, of course, he made mention about the schoolhouse, the Catholic schoolhouse, when they were digging a foxhole in front of the convent. The schoolhouse is right across the street, fronting the convent. And of course, he made mention that after the march, all the prisoners were kept in the Catholic school, and the Catholic school was, according to him, part of the complex where Father Andrew Cervini was staying at the time. And he also made mention about the death of one of the American officers, Mr. Pratt, after the death march due to exhaustion. And there he was staying on the, Fullerton was staying on the 3rd floor of one of the school buildings where they were being kept. And I have here a photo. I got this one from a famous historian in Iligan City, and of course in NSUIT, Mr. Calwen, Professor Calwen. And I got this from his Facebook of a clear picture of the school buildings in St. Michael's College, Escuela de San Miguel before. And you can find there the 3 floors, and this school building is right in front of the convent. And most probably on the 3rd floor, that 3rd floor there, because you can see some priests and nuns staying on the 3rd floor. This is the area where the prisoners after the death march were kept by the Japanese. And this is also the courtyard that he mentioned facing the convent where Father Andrew Cervini was staying. And this is the present location of St. Michael's College. In the Google map, you can find it there, St. Michael's College. Then you have Quezon Avenue, the main avenue in Iligan City. Then the convent, the current convent, which I presume it was also the convent where Father Andrew Cervini was staying. And you have there a vacant space, the courtyard. And during my high school days, it was once a basketball court. And St. Michael's College is run by the Religious of the Virgin Mary, who is also running the Lourdes School College in Cagayan de Oro City. The eighth source that I'm going to present to you is a case presented before the Military Commission entitled United States of America versus Yichi Ota. And one of those testimonies that were presented against Ota was the perpetual testimony of Richard P. Beck, the one that you have seen in the video, mentioning, of course, the Death March in Iligan. And of course, the ninth source that is available, that I have a copy of which, is the case that was again brought before the U.S. Military Commission, which was organized again by Douglas MacArthur. And this one is in Manila. And this one is a case against Masaharu Homa. Homa was the commanding general that led the Japanese forces in invading the Philippines. He was here in the entire duration of the war. And one of those atrocities he committed was the Death March in Iligan on July 4 of 1942. And one of the witnesses that were called by the Military Commission was by Marcelino Sayo. And during the examination, direct examination, he was asked where he was taken, and he made mention about they were taken to Iligan City. And Sayo was a Filipino, one of the Filipino survivors of the Iligan Death March. And the next one is, of course, a very famous personality, a Filipino survivor. He was there in Dansalan. He was one of those few that were selected by the Japanese to stay in Camp Keithley while his colleagues were forced to march towards Iligan City. This one is coming from Jose Lucban, and he was called before the Military Commission and discussed about in details of the Iligan Death March, especially prior to the Iligan Death March and the execution of some American officers before the start of the Death March. And Jose Lucban is quite famous, especially for those students who are taking up public international law. He was also involved in the Kuruda case, in the famous Kuruda case that promotes the doctrine of incorporating the generally accepted principles of international law as part of the law of the land. And he was one of those who testified against Huma pertaining to the Iligan Death March on July 4, 1942. And of course, another one is from Jusana. Jusana is one of the survivors of the Iligan Death March, a Filipino, and he mentioned in details, he was asked during the direct examination, the details of the Iligan Death March. And of course, during the closing argument of the U.S. versus Homa, it made mention on the command responsibility of General Homa, resulting to the death of some Filipinos and Americans on the Iligan Death March. And Homa was convicted before the Military Commission, and he was sentenced he was shot to death with musketry as the decision of the what you call this one, of the Military Commission. The third primary source, the last primary source that I'm going to present to you, is another decision coming from the Military Commission organized by General Douglas MacArthur. The case is entitled United States of America versus Tanaka. And I don't have a copy of the depositions, the pleadings. What I have is a copy of the decisions made by the Military Commission. And this Military Commission happened in Yokohama, Japan. And it made mention of the several witnesses that were called before the Military Commission trying, and they were being accused for the Iligan Death March and the execution of Brigadier General Guy Oforth. One of those witnesses was an American who stayed for a long time before the war, and even right after the war, Edward M. Cooder, and he was a very famous guy, very close to the Maranaos in Lanao and the people in Iligan City, and published several books, and he was one of the witnesses. The next witness was a Filipino, and based on his family name, I have a suspicion that he is an Iliganon. And when I check in Facebook, there are several Iliganons that were named after Petronio C. in Cabo, but I have to verify it whether they are related. But I have a high suspicion that he is from Iligan. He is an Iliganon, and he was called also before the military commission, accusing Tanaka of the military atrocities, mentioning, of course, the Iligan Death March. And another Filipino was also being called, Lieutenant Colonel Tiborcio Naidas. There were also Japanese soldiers that were in Dansalan, part of the were in the Death March. Komatsu, Kobayashi, Hiramatsu, Arai, Murakami, and Jimbo all were Japanese soldiers who were there in Dansalan, present during the Death March, and in Iligan, and they testified against Tanaka that it was his command. And one of the judges in the military commission asked the Japanese why the atrocities were committed by the soldiers. And Kiyoshi Arai made mention that he had no control of the Japanese soldiers that were assigned in Dansalan and in Camp Keithley because they were sick in the brain. And that's probably the reason why they have that barbaric acts they committed against the Filipino and the American soldiers. And I hope I will be having a copy of the details of the testimonies of the witnesses on this case on U.S. versus Yoshinari Tanaka. And this is the picture of Camp Keithley, and I just got it from the free data from Google. And this is the picture also of Brigadier General Guy Oforth. He survived in the Iligan Death March. He was humiliated and he was sent to various camps in the Philippines. And then he was again returned to Dansalan, and there he was executed. And based on the records, he was the highest American military official that was executed in the Philippines during the Second World War. And this is the map of the Google map, and this is what are we going to do with this? Now I am telling you about the presence of several sources where we can get several information about the Iligan Death March. What are we going to do? I would suggest that there must be a landmark of heroism of the Americans and Filipinos involved on the Death March. And number two, I would even suggest that St. Michael's College, there must be placed a historical landmark, because you notice it in the Bataan Death March, several buildings and roads were historical landmarks were placed by the National Historical Institute and by the government, but you cannot find one here in Iligan City. And I would even suggest that a local ordinance should be made, or an executive order from the city mayor, to declare July 4 of every year as in Iligan as American Japanese Filipino Friendship Day. And of course, we have to continue doing some research and to study and search for the truth on what really happened on July 4 of 1942, which now I call as the Iligan Death March. And in closing, I have two slides here to close my presentation. In one of the testimonies of Jose S. Giusana, before the military commission, he was asked about this question: did you see anything else on this march? And he made mention, he said that I saw one civilian boxed by a Japanese guard in that march. He was giving us bananas and other things, but the Japanese boxed him with his rifle. And this happened in Maria Cristina area in Iligan City, telling everyone by reading this document that there were civilians who witnessed the death march, and some of the civilians were giving food to the marchers, for those soldiers, prisoners of wars on that Iligan Death March. I would say that the spirit of heroism and solidarity of the Iligan and the civilians during this time. And lastly, in the book by John Keats about Colonel Fertig and Hedges, famous guerrilla leaders in Northern Mindanao and perhaps even in Mindanao,
Hello.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Sir June. Ako, so much information, but we have very, very limited time, sadly. But I believe to our listeners, we have our viewers from Iligan City through the Iligan City LGU page. They have heard your recommendation. I hopefully they will consider your recommendation as well. And